Okay, Mac users. So if you're watching this, you probably have a Mac and you're familiar with at least the word GarageBand. Now, GarageBand is Apple's own audio recording and editing software. It's free. You can get it back from the App Store if you don't have it on your machine. I do encourage you to clear up some space. So if you notice that your hard drive is really full right now, this would be a good opportunity to clear up some extra space because it can be quite big. And if you don't have a lot of space, I'm going to show you how you can free up some space on the installation of GarageBand should you be really running up against the end of your hard drive. So to get started, we just need to launch GarageBand once we have it installed. And when you do, you will get this prompt that says, "Thank you for downloading GarageBand from the Mac App Store. Let's install 2.13 gigabytes of audio files." And these audio files are loops to create your own music. And these loops are individual sound clips of like drums and piano and sound effects. And should you not be needing to do any looping of any kind, you can skip it. You do not have to install it on top of the installation of GarageBand. So immediately when this shows up, you will get this prompt and you can hit download later, and you will get this that says to download essential sounds and settings. It was canceled. You can do it from blah. Now here's the rub. Every time you launch GarageBand, it's going to prompt you to do this. Unfortunately, there's no way to skip it. So all I usually do is I hit download later and then immediately hit continue. Don't hit finish download because then it'll go back to the progress bar and fill up your hard drive. Once that gets stopped, it'll bring you to one of two things. One is if you already are working on an audio file, it'll open up the last one that you've been working on in GarageBand. So you can actually see this is actually a real show that I produced very recently, and you can see all the editing that I've done. And this was done all through Zoom. I have 2 tracks, one for me, one for my remote recording. I have some extra additional tracks to kind of dump content, and I'll cover that in a little bit. And then I have our top track, which is actually there's actually 2. I have some audio punch-ins to kind of describe what's going on in the show. And then this is our music. These yellow lines that you see, this is ducking. And I'll cover all of this in a second. But before we get into this, I wanted to give you a glimpse of what an average podcast can look like. Now this is fairly technical because there's several different things that were going on in this. I'm going to show you the bare bones. Remember, everything that I preface is usually between Basecamp and Everest. And this definitely came towards more of the Everest of editing. This tutorial is going to focus more on the Basecamp. So when you actually get started in GarageBand, if you've never worked on a file, you'll get something that looks a lot more like this, which is called Choose a Project. There's only one, Empty Project. We're going to go ahead and click on this, and we're going to hit Choose. Now, once you do, you get prompted with these 3 buckets: software instrument, audio, and drummer. You're going to be using in audio the record using a microphone or line input. I'm going to go ahead and hit Create. Here's the thing that we need to do to set up what I call a podcast template. Now, GarageBand is predominantly meant for musicians, and so for podcasting, it doesn't make a lot of sense. First and foremost, the count click track and the metronome. We need to disable both of those, otherwise you'll hear this as you're recording. It'll drive you bonkers. So first things first, if we come across the top where we have our play deck, where we can play, pause, record, and loop, we have our timing, which we'll change that in a second. We have our tuning, and then we have our count in and our metronome. They're both purple. Turn those off immediately. The next thing we need to do is, instead of beat, bar, and tempo, because we're not doing music, we need a time code. So to change that, it's real simple. Hit the little chevron to the right, go down to where it says time. And now you have a proper time code. The other things that we need to do is I like to optimize as much space as possible on my screen. We don't need a library because we're not doing anything from it. We can close it by hitting the drawer icon over on the top left. And for track mastering and master controls, we don't need this right now. So I'm going to go ahead and hide it by hitting the little dial. There. Now I have a really good setup for doing my podcast. A couple other things I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and hit save, because as you can tell, we have untitled. Let's go ahead and hit File, Save As, and let's go ahead and save this either on your desktop or your external drive. So now I'm saving it onto my external drive. If you can't find your drive, or if you have other places on your computer you need to access, do bear in mind you do have this extra chevron to the right, which will allow you to really dig deep if you need a specific place that you're trying to save this. And just like that, we now have a saved project. It's really important that you do this at the beginning. That way, as you hit Command S on your keyboard, it will save it, and that way you get into that habit. Friends don't let friends trust autosave in a digital age, especially in production. Things can go wrong. One of the tips I want to throw out, a pro tip, especially if you're working on a MacBook or MacBook Pro, do plug in. Okay, don't just edit off of your battery, because using graphically intensive things and audio intensive things drains your battery probably twice as fast as normal, because your fans are kicked in and there's some other processing stuff going on. And especially if you start up GarageBand, sometimes if you're not even plugged in, GarageBand will point out that they recommend that you do, because also a lot of MacBooks by default, when you're off of the plug, you're actually at throttled or lower power. So things run a little bit chunky or clicky. So if you've noticed on your MacBook, if you ever use GarageBand and things start to stutter, that's not necessarily your audio file, but it might be your Mac trying to save some processing power for sake of your battery. So always plug in. So now that I have that disclaimer out of the way, let's go ahead and bring in the tracks that we did in Zoom. So I'm going to go ahead and move this over, and I'm going to go into my audio record, and I'm going to go ahead and drag and drop these individual tracks. This audio only, I'm going to drag in and drop it at the beginning. And I'm going to take my second track, which is my podcast partner, put it into here as well. And you notice what's great about GarageBand is every time you drag and drop it in, it will render what's called a waveform. This is the actual, if you think of it like a record, like an old school record, these are the etchings that you would, if hyper on a microscope, see within the vinyl. Not precisely this, but it's the same essence, where you actually see the peaks and valleys that represent vocal pattern. Now the other thing I'm going to do, if you notice when I drag in those tracks, it gives it the name from Zoom. This is great and all, but I like normal names. So I'm going to click on this and just say AJ Mike. And on this one, I'm going to go ahead and just say Chris Mike. It's always good to have good naming procedure, just because as you get more complex, you'll know what tracks go where and you know what you're adjusting. The last thing I'm going to do is in my audio recording file, you won't necessarily have this, but I have a music track that we've produced for our regular show. What I'm going to do is take Cool Groove, just drag it down to the bottom. This first audio track, when GarageBand gets created, they just create this automatically. We can get rid of it real simply by hitting Command Delete. You can't just hit Delete. Hit Command Delete with the audio one track selected. You can tell it's selected because it has this light gray field. If it's dark gray, it's unselected. Light gray means it's selected. Command Delete, and now you have everything all synced up. Now, once we have this, there's one other thing, and I mentioned this in the previous video. The trick to getting all of the controls of GarageBand is a hidden key command, and it's called automation. To get it done, to get it open, we have to hit a key on our keyboard, and it's just simply the A key. So if I hit A, and if we look right over here, a new icon gets created, which looks like, kind of looks like a chart, something out of Excel. And this gets us that line leveling or ducking that we can do so that certain audio can be louder and certain audio can be lower. Also, when we have the A key enabled, you notice that the tracks kind of go dark because it's focusing on the volume line. And I'll get to this in a little bit. But if you're just doing editing, this can be quite annoying. Go ahead and hit the A key one more time, or you can hit the power button right here that will enable or disable automation. If you hit the A key, it will kick on and off that automation. And typically this is how I like to work, because either I'm working in volume or I'm working in editing. So now that we have that, I'm going to go through a couple other controls that we can do. If you have a small screen like a 13-inch or 12-inch MacBook, you're still probably pressed for screen space. Another helpful trick is these drawers we can compress by grabbing the line and shrinking them as far back as we can. Now, another trick that we can do is control the time sequence across the top in the zoom, how big zoomed in we are on a track or how zoomed out we are on a track. By clicking and dragging the slider, if you wing it all the way to the right, we can see the vocal hairs on my chinny chin chin, as it were. And if we zoom out, we can see the length of our entire project. So this is super helpful. I usually come in and out a lot. And a really nice trick to know exactly where you are, because you can get lost doing this, is whenever you grab your playhead, that's this little shuttle or scrub bar that the playhead is the actual line. When you hit play and pause, where it stops is your playhead. Wherever you place your playhead on your timeline, you'll get a time code so you know where in the timeline you are. And then if we add our zoom, you notice the zoom focuses on where the playhead last ended. So if you're really trying to hunt down a or a F-bomb that accidentally gets dropped and you need to get rid of it, you can put your playhead at the beginning or end of where that oops is and zoom in. And that's the easiest way to get into zoom without, kind of losing track where you're at. So let's go ahead and let's take a look at what we're going to do in our next part. Now that we got all of our audio in, and I've gone over some of the interface controls that you can do. Remember, the A key is going to be your friend here shortly. Now, if I were to bring my playhead to the beginning and I push play, now I can also hit spacebar on my keyboard and that will also automatically play. Wow, that's loud. There's a cool trick that we can do in both Audacity and GarageBand, which is called muting and soloing. Muting is pretty self-explanatory. Over here in our drawer, we have the mute button, which will mute tracks individually. Or if you're used to playing on stage and you have a solo, you can solo a track. Soloing is the opposite of muting, where if you solo a track, it will mute all other tracks above and below and only play the track that you are soloing. This is a good way to be able to isolate if there's a certain thing that you're trying to find. Soloing a track while it's in timeline helps with being able to figure out what edit marks you need to make. So one of the things I'm going to do is mute our cool groove. And I'm also going to take this and put it on the top. If you click on the drawer and you drag it to the top, it'll allow you to relayer the audio in an organization that is helpful for you. I'm going to mute that for the time being, and I'm going to go ahead and hit play pause and hear my AJ mic and Chris mic.
We are online.
So we can hear that there's myself and my podcast partner.
We'll still have stuff. Maybe I don't need to get a year's worth.
That sounds pretty good. Remember, when you drag in your audio tracks, you want to make sure that out of Zoom, that they're all the way to the beginning. If they're staggered, you'll get an out of sync.
Heck yeah.
And so now my show is out of sync. We want to make sure that we're always synced up when we're editing. Another thing that might happen is there's a spot on both tracks that we need to get rid of. Well, what we can do is we can take our playhead and select all of the tracks that are applicable to where the edit mark needs to be, or a split. We can do that by clicking on a track, and you can tell that the track is enabled because it's got this kind of yellowish bar. If I hold Shift on my keyboard and click on the next track, it means that those two tracks are now joined, and whatever I do is going to apply to both. So let's say I needed to take out this section, this very small section of audio, or better yet, because I know our show starts way back here, I'm going to go ahead and get rid of this section. Well, what I can do is use the Command T, which is trim. And what that does is, because I had those tracks selected and I have the playhead right where I needed it, I now have two sections of audio. Now something we can do is I could add a new track. Let's say I wanted to keep this, but I didn't want it at the beginning. Maybe I need it elsewhere. Double click in the gray area below and that will automatically create a new track, or two tracks if you need it. And we can call this B-roll. B-roll 2. And what this allows you to do, let's say I needed to move this. Click and click using Shift. We'll select both of those tracks. I can then move them in the timeline that I have them, or I can move them down below so that I can keep them, mute them, kind of like in the sample that I showed you when I first loaded. Another cool trick is you can use marquee, which is click and drag. And as long as you touch the top of an audio track, it'll be selected. And then I can move it into sync to where I need it. Now, if I were to play this, interesting.
And we're also doing our part to try to not be muted.
All right, AJ and Chris, that sounds pretty good. So now what we need to do is do some audio leveling. Remember the A key? I'm gonna go ahead and push A and enable that automation. And I'm gonna zoom in at the beginning. Now a trick that we can do is we can add a ducking of our music. I'm gonna unmute it. We're going to add some enveloping points. Enveloping points just mean an anchor point on the volume line so that we have a beginning to an end and the grade in between is a fade. I'm going to go ahead and mark one here. And I'm going to mark one here. I take this and I drag it down. You'll notice that I have this playing at full volume, tapering down, and then this goes at a lower volume. Now let's say I wanted this to go on the opposite. Let's say I wanted it to go back up to the normal volume. I will add 2 more points, about where I want the fade to be. And you can control the fade by just clicking and dragging those points individually. So if you need it shorter or longer, you can. And then I can raise this other part back up, because let's say I need this to be back to what's called unity or 0. So as I do this, you're probably asking, well, how do I know? How do I know it's going to line up to the other one that I already did? As I click and drag, you'll see that the volume is shown in decibels. So I reduced it to negative 20-ish decibels. I'm going to bring it back up to 0, which means that it is not gained, meaning louder, and not turned down. So as long as I get it back to 0, I know that this line and this line are the same. So let's go ahead and play that really quickly. Okay, that's way too long. I'm going to go ahead and move my tracks. Click, drag, use marquee. Move these over so it's a lot faster. And with it, I can also move my enveloping points. Click in between the 2 points while you have the automation tool on, and that allows you to move marked points that you've already done. And if I go ahead and move this all the way over, now I know that it's going to start, decrease down, and then eventually pick back up on the other side. So that's a fast and easy way to be able to do ducking. Let's take a listen. Because you and I are both family men, and so the dynamics of having everybody in. Okay, that sounds pretty good. The other tricks that we can do is the same thing that we turned up and down or ducked this audio in between our audio tracks. We can also do the same thing with individual tracks. So let's say I wasn't as loud as Chris was in our show. What I can do is enable the track for volume here. And again, I can add a couple of enveloping points and turn up certain sections or turn down certain sections. So if you have somebody who is very gregarious with a microphone and you really need to turn them down because maybe the other people that are in your call weren't as loud and gregarious, you're able to isolate that in certain sections of your show. And this is really helpful. As a pro tip, look for laughter. Laughter usually is a pretty high peak, and it can be distracting for your show. So right here, as you can tell with the relative rest of our show, this is a fairly loud segment. If I found that this needed to be turned down just ever so slightly, I could add some enveloping points, zoom in here, add some enveloping points, and just turn that section down relative to the rest of the conversation. Or if you need to mute it, turn it all the way down. And this is the other pro tip that I wanted to mention from the reason why we set it up with this multi-track setup to start with. Let's say there was something that just happened on the other end and a person was talking, but on your end, let's say that the noise happened. Well, if we mute just that section in the same timeline as the person who's talking, we won't hear the disruption that was on your microphone. We'll only hear the person that was actually talking. And this can save entire segments of your show. So that's a good way to be able to notch or mute subsections within your timeline. So now that we have basically our show ducked and weaved the way that we like. To recap, we have different tracks for all of our things, including music, our two mics that we have from Zoom, and then making some B-roll tracks. That way you can keep content. Remember, when you move content, you want to move them in time. So make sure you don't just grab one single audio track. You want to be able to grab them by using either the mark key or clicking on them and holding Shift so that they're selected. Now, another trick that we can do is, let's say we needed to move this in time to another part. There's a tool that's enabled called snapping. You can go up into your edit and you can use what's called alignment guides or your snapping. So when I have these, if I select them, notice that there's this yellow line, and that's how you can tell that the end of this is the beginning of this segment. And this is really helpful if you're trying to align multiple layers all within different tracks. So now that I have everything the way that I want, there's two things I want to show when it comes to exporting. Let's say in your editing, you needed to select a small section to submit it for maybe a peer review or just as a sample. We can do that just within GarageBand by using the cycle tool. Cycle allows you to select by using the timeline up above. This yellow segment is the selected cycle that we can export. Now, the other reason why I point this out is because if you ever export your show and you notice that you're not getting all 5 or 10 minutes, but only a small 30-second clip, it could be that cycle is enabled. So if you don't want cycle, you might have accidentally just double selected or accidentally drug up here and you forgot about it. Or if you get into this weird loop where it only plays in a certain section, that's probably because cycle is selected. I'm going to go ahead and just disable it by using the little reverse arrow icon, and that will disable that. Now that we know that cycle is turned off, I'm going to go ahead and export. Now, if you're used to other audio editors, you're probably going, where is the export? Sharing is caring. Apple kind of renamed export to share. So I'm going to go share, export song to disk. And when I do, I can save this project out. This is where you would want to put in the name of your show, my podcast, episode 3. Be sure that you name it something proper, because if you do anything snarky, bear in mind that if you're submitting this on Canvas, the actual clear name of the episode is passed through. So, for instance, a few quarters back, there was a class I was working with, and the faculty pointed out that there was a student that put a snarky remark in the name of the title of their show. Now, it was funny, but saying that this assignment sucks or whatever, bear in mind that we might be able to see that when you distribute your show. So it's always good practice in general to make sure that you save it as a proper name. You're going to stick it wherever you want. I'm going to stick it on my external drive. I'm going to make it in MP3 and quality. This I want to go over really quickly because you might be inclined to just go highest quality because it's the best. Think of this as a throttle of how much your show is going to be in megabytes. Podcasting in general, you want it to be lightweight, accessible audio files because you don't want people to blow through their data caps. So typically speaking, if it's a small show, maybe a 5 minutes, maybe 10 minutes at the most, using high quality 192 kilobytes per second kbps is probably fine. But for a 30-minute show or more, this can make your episode several hundreds of megabytes. Typically speaking, podcasts are produced on this medium quality, which is 128 kilobits a second, which especially for longer form stuff is going to be your go-to. Low quality should be avoided at all costs in my opinion, and highest quality is really only intended for archival purposes. So medium or high quality. The other thing I want to point out is the export cycle area checkbox. Notice on mine it is unchecked, which means my entire show is going to be exported. If I had that cycle section clicked on and I had this, that's how you can export just a section of your show. It's a really helpful thing. Making sure that that's unchecked, I'm going to go ahead and hit export. And just like that, we now have an audio file that we can then upload to a host. So in my next video, I'm going to go to Audacity and kind of show the same workflow that I did with GarageBand, but in the Audacity ecosystem. And then in the last video, I'll show how to upload these files either to Canvas, which obviously you just have to submit it. If it's an assignment, you're going to attach it no differently than you would any other piece of media. But if your faculty is requiring you to load it up onto a host, I have 2 hosts for you to take a look at to submit it as a link to Canvas. So look for those coming up.